our sure and steady anchor. When everything changes, He is unchangeable. Enlisted by God and enduring through pain, He steps forward on our behalf. The rich food our souls need, and the one we must imitate to live fruitful lives. Jesus is better.
Well, this week begins Hebrews chapter 5, and as we look at Hebrews chapter 5, we're going to be taking a look at a theme that actually extends through chapter 7 at least in kind of direct discussion, but really kind of goes throughout the rest of the book of Hebrews, and it's this concept of Jesus as our great high priest. So I don't want to exhaust the topic. I certainly can't exhaust the topic today, but I want to kind of get us into this mood of thinking about Jesus as our high priest. As I was preparing for this, listening, there was another pastor that I heard who mentioned being confronted with a Roman Catholic friend talking about, how do you function without a priest? Because in the Roman Catholic system, you have people, maybe you grew up in this background where, you would go to a priest and the priest would kind of stand between you and God effectively, who would give you the sacraments to perform, who would issue penance to do. And, the question came up as far as how would you deal with this? Now, as a pastor, I don't do those things. As a pastor, I shepherd you, I care for you, but nobody comes to me and asks me to confess these things, and I don't give you little hoops to jump through. And the response of this pastor was, we do have a priest, his name is Jesus. And so as we look at this for the really next few months, most likely, is how it's going to be drawn out, these next few months, thinking about Jesus as our great high priest, I want you to think about the fact that what a priest does is he stands between you and God. And throughout the Old Testament, you see prophets and you see priests. You see these two offices that God has ordered, these two offices that God has designed. And the role of the prophet is to mediate God's word to people. And the role of the priest is to mediate people in the presence of God. And so for us as human beings, the question might come in, why do we need a priest? And kind of Christianity 101 is this: because we are sinful, because we are corrupt, because as human beings, we can't enter God's presence on our own. Because to stand in God's presence without some type of a sacrifice, without something to make up for the lack in us, something to make up for what is wrong with us and our sin and our alienation from God, we simply can't do it. And so we need a priest. We need somebody to stand between us and God who can take our case before the Father and can continually bring that before him. And that's the picture we have of Jesus in the book of Hebrews. So this morning, as we take a look at this angle in Hebrews chapter 5, I want us to not only see that and kind of get that initial taste for what is it for us to have a priest, but I want us to see what the author of Hebrews lays out for us, and that's the priest that we have, the high priest that we have, is not just somebody who comes to fill in the gaps where the priests in the Old Testament failed. But what we have is we have Jesus, the eternal Son, who comes to stand in that place. That's a really big deal. It's a really big deal. And we'll see that contrasted this morning as the author's letter begins his discussion looking at how the human priesthood functioned and how Jesus comes in and he completely changes how we understand that. How these first century Jewish people have understood how a priest functions. So Jesus the Son, the high priest, that's the title. Nothing too fancy this morning, appointed by God in service of the people. Hebrews 5, 1 through 10. I'll read the passage for us, starting in verse 1. For every high priest chosen from among men is appointed to act on behalf of men in relation to God, to offer gifts and sacrifices for sins. He can deal gently with the ignorant and wayward, since he himself is beset with weakness. Because of this, he is obligated to offer sacrifice for his own sins, just as he does for those of the people, and no one takes this honor for himself, but only when called by God, just as Aaron was. So also Christ did not exalt himself to be made a high priest, but was appointed by him who said to him, "You are my son. Today I have begotten you." As he says also in another place, "You are a priest forever, after the order of Melchizedek." In the days of his flesh, Jesus offered up prayers and supplications with loud cries and tears to him who was able to save him from death, and he was heard because of his reverence. Although he was a son, he learned obedience through what he suffered, and being made perfect, he became the source of eternal salvation to all who obey him, being designated by God a high priest after the order of Melchizedek. So the name Melchizedek shows up twice here. You may have heard it before, maybe you haven't. That's not a big deal because you're going to hear it a lot in a couple of months. We're not going to camp out on this priest in the order of Melchizedek this morning, but just to kind of give you the initial thought on it, this idea of priest after the order of Melchizedek, you have the Aaronic priesthood. You have the priests who descend from Aaron. And these guys are born, they have kids, they die, they have kids, they die, that kind of a thing. But Melchizedek is this curious figure that shows up early on, and he hangs out with Abraham. And he seems to come out of nowhere, and he just leaves. It's this kind of almost bizarre scene that occurs in the book of Genesis. And what the author's letter is saying is that if you're going to understand Jesus' priesthood, you need to understand that it transcends anything that you may have been used to. And so even if you come from a Roman Catholic background, it's important for us to think of a priest not as some guy who's sitting there with a white collar and a black shirt or a robe, but to think of a priest that Jesus is a priest from all of eternity who's set apart for this task of pleading the cause of his people, of loving his people. And that's a pretty remarkable thing as we consider who Jesus is. So here's your big idea for the morning. The priesthood of Jesus on behalf of his people is utterly unique from any other because it is the service of the Son for a people he loves to the point of pouring out his own life on their behalf. So the priesthood of Jesus on behalf of his people is utterly unique, so that's that Melchizedekan priesthood thing. It's utterly unique from any other because it is the service of the Son for a people he loves to the point of pouring out his own life on their behalf. As we'll see in just a few minutes here, when we think about this, the service of the Son, I just want you to be thinking how much more significant as we move to that discussion in a few minutes. I want you to be thinking before we get there about how much more significant it would be for you if you're running a business to hire your son, your beloved son, who does a great job with everything, to say, I'm bringing him on board and I want him to run this business, as opposed to taking applications, as opposed to some guy coming in off the street saying, I'm going to do a good job for you. Just think about how much more precious it would be for you to hire your son in that role. And you'll get a little taste of where we're going to go with how pleased God is with his son's work. So Jesus, unlike any other. Hebrews 5:1-4, I'm going to read this again. For every high priest chosen from among men is appointed to act on behalf of men in relation to God, to offer gifts and sacrifices for sins. He can deal gently with the ignorant and wayward, since he himself is beset with weakness. Because of this, he is obligated to offer sacrifice for his own sins, just as he does for those of the people, and no one takes this honor for himself, but only when called by God, just as Aaron was. So these first 4 verses hold out for us this picture of the Aaronic priesthood. And as we think about what these people who would have received this letter 2,000 years ago, as they're receiving this letter, and they're thinking about this return to Judaism, that was the threat facing them, this return to Judaism, to kind of downplay Jesus and his significance, and to say, well, there is comfort to be found in Judaism. There's comfort to be found in the traditions of our fathers. We didn't get persecuted by the Romans when we were adhering to that system, and we're starting to feel some pressure and some society breathing down our neck type of things. And so with that happening, the temptation is to say we want to return to the traditions of our fathers. And of great significance to them was the priesthood, because all of the life of the Hebrew people was centered around the service of the temple. All of the life of the people was centered around this regular reminder of their sin, because there's always sacrifice being made. As you read throughout the Old Testament, you look at the first 5 books of the Bible, you see God's prescription for how the people are to relate with their sin. And they relate to their sin not by saying, you know what, I'm just going to say I'm sorry and move on, but God shows just how significant sin is by calling for regular sacrifice to be made. Because the understanding, and this is true and this is right, is that sin is ultimately against God. And to have a God who is holy and God who is just, to simply be appeased by saying, well, I'm sorry, it just doesn't cut it. It doesn't cut it. And all the way going back to the first few chapters of the Bible in the book of Genesis, you see that sin always has to be dealt with by the shedding of blood, by life being taken, because sin is an offense against life. And so the people, the Hebrew people, as they receive this letter, are thinking, well, I understand what you're saying about Jesus if he's so great, but what about the Old Testament? What about this priesthood? Because, we had our friend down the street in each of the tribes. They had a responsibility to support the work of the priests. And in that support, the people regularly brought to them their sacrifices. They regularly brought to them, whether it's, little pigeons or goats or cows or things like that. They bring them to them, and they would be reminded as the priest takes them about their sinfulness and then about the responsibility they had before God to deal with their sin. And so the people are thinking, well, what about Jesus and Christianity? How does this actually line up with something we're so used to? And there's such a great comfort for them in seeing this regular reminder. I mean, perhaps if you grew up in a Roman Catholic background, there's a sense of security when you see the sacraments laid out. And to think, well, this is tangible. I can touch this. I can go to the confessional and I can say this, and the priest can give me these things to do, and I can feel comfort by knowing that I've done these things and now I'm right with God. And yet the message of the gospel is that you're made right with God through the work of one priest, through Jesus. And so what's going to unfold here is this introductory talk about Jesus as the high priest, as he is presented to the people as saying, you guys, if you think that you need a priest, you're right, but the kind of priest you need is not one in the order of Aaron, not one who has what he says here, someone beset with weakness. See, Jesus experienced weakness, but not in the way that the Aaronic priests experienced it. And we'll get into that here. Hebrews 7, a little fast forward, like I said, this takes up a few chapters. Hebrews 7, 23 through 28 says this: the former priests, these are the Aaronic priests, were many in number because they were prevented by death from continuing in office. But he, Jesus, holds his priesthood permanently because he continues forever. Consequently, he is able to save to the uttermost those who draw near to God through him, since he always lives to make intercession for them. For it was indeed fitting that we should have such a high priest, holy, innocent, unstained, separated from sinners, and exalted above the heavens. He has no need, like those high priests, to offer sacrifices daily, first for his own sins and then for those of the people, since he did this once for all when he offered up himself. For the law appoints men in their weakness as high priests, but the word of the oath, which came later than the law, appoints a son who has been made perfect forever. So you see this distinction between the work of the Son and how acceptable in God's sight it is, and then the work of these priests who need regularly to bring not only a sacrifice for the sins of the people, but for themselves. The relationship between man and man is one that is always marked by a shared relationship with sin and a common need for forgiveness. So as I get together with people and as I talk with folks about sin, if somebody comes to me and says, you know what, Chris, I'm really struggling with this. There's a high likelihood I've probably struggled with that myself at some point. And I think for people, at least in my experience, when people come and they talk about issues of sin in their life, their first instinct is to think that we're the only one who deals with it. Our first instinct is to think that we're the only one who understands what it feels like, or maybe we're worse than anybody else who deals with this because, fill in the blank, you know what's wrong with you. You may not see what's wrong with everybody else the same way. And so when you kind of break that barrier and you go to somebody, you go to another person and you say, you know what, I'm struggling with this. The other person says, hey, I am as well, or I have as well. There's a sense of comfort that's had from that. There's a sense of comfort that's had from that because as human beings, when we think about our sin, there's a way that we can relate to each other because we're both victims, as it were, of sin and its power. We're both participants in sin and what it does. We share in this common bond that we have an enemy in sin that we have been at one point conquered by. And now as Christians, we have a degree of freedom from, because it no longer enslaves us, even though we continue to struggle with it. And so for human beings, as we experience these things, and this is, again, going back to the sense of comfort that people had, they could go to Aaron and they could say, you know, Aaron, I'm bringing a sacrifice to my sin, but I see in you that you yourself need a sacrifice. And so there's a place at which this ability that the author of Hebrews has communicated, where he says that there's this ability that the priesthood, that the high priest has, because he himself is beset with weakness. This relationship that he can share with us is something that's not something that Jesus can share. He can't share with us in the sense of this weakness because sin has not conquered him, has not touched him. So what I want to communicate here is that, yes, we feel a degree of comfort when we see sinful people, when we see other sinful people, and we can identify with them. But in just a second, I want you to see that Jesus' relationship with sin as the one who resisted in every way is of greater comfort to us than just going to somebody and saying, we both struggle with the same thing. Leviticus 16, 1 through 13, here's how the Aaronic priesthood is presented to us. And this is, by the way, a week from today is actually the day that this is celebrated by the Jewish people, Yom Kippur, which is the Day of Atonement. And this is what's spoken of in Leviticus 16. So I'm going to read this for us here. And we're going to see exactly what these people would have been thinking when they thought about their relationship, their shared relationship with sin, and how they relate to God with the priesthood. The Lord spoke to Moses after the death of the two sons of Aaron, when they drew near before the Lord and died. And the Lord said to Moses, tell Aaron your brother not to come at any time into the holy place inside the veil before the mercy seat that is on the ark, so that he may not die. For I will appear in the cloud over the mercy seat, but in this way Aaron shall come into the holy place, with a bull from the herd for a sin offering and a ram for a burnt offering. He shall put on the holy linen coat, and shall have the linen undergarment on his body, and he shall tie the linen sash around his waist and wear the linen turban. These are the holy garments. He shall bathe his body in water and then put them on. And he shall take from the congregation of the people of Israel 2 male goats for a sin offering and 1 ram for a burnt offering. Aaron shall offer the bull as a sin offering for himself, and shall make atonement for himself and for his house. Then he shall take the 2 goats and set them before the Lord at the entrance of the tent of meeting, and Aaron shall cast lots over the 2 goats. One lot for the Lord, and the other lot for Azazel. And Aaron shall present the goat on which the lot fell for the Lord and use it as a sin offering, but the goat on which the lot fell for Azazel shall be presented alive before the Lord to make atonement over it, that it may be sent away into the wilderness to Azazel. Just a heads up, when it says Azazel there's a little bit of confusion as to what that actually means. The highest likelihood, what's being communicated here, is that it's kind of being sent out to Satan, okay, to death. Aaron shall present the bull as a sin offering for himself, and shall make atonement for himself and for his house. He shall kill the bull as a sin offering for himself. And he shall take a censer full of coals of fire from the altar before the Lord, and 2 handfuls of sweet incense beaten small, and he shall bring it inside the veil, and put the incense on the fire before the Lord, that the cloud of the incense may cover the mercy seat that is over the testimony, so that he does not die. So this passage begins with talking about how the priest's responsibility is to come before the presence of God with beauty and with cleanliness. Okay, most of us, most likely, are used to showering daily, unless you're a child in my home, and then you kind of throw a fit over that. Anyways, most of us, however, are used to showering daily. And so, if you imagine what it would have been for people 4,000 years ago, on a regular daily basis, dwelling in the desert, these are people who don't have running water. These are people who head on out to the neighborhood stream to go and bathe. It's not happening every day. These are people who are used to seeing others with dirt caked on their faces and dirty feet. And so what's happening here is you're seeing that God is laying out for the people this sense of purity, this sense of cleanliness, without which nobody can appear before him. And so for these people to see the high priest as he has taken a bath, he's putting on these beautiful clothes that are reserved for this particular experience, they're seeing something that was quite unique. Because they're seeing somebody who is regularly kind of stained with dirt, made holy, made beautiful. And yet what happens here is that it's not enough for him to simply put on these garments and appear before God, because what has to happen in order for him to appear before God and not die, That's literally the language that's spoken of here. For him to not die is to come before God with some type of offering, and an offering of great worth, an offering of great significance. To bring before God a life that is taken. And this life would not only be for the people, but it would be something that he needed to bring, this high priest needed to bring in for himself. Because if he were to come in simply with an outer cleaning, it wouldn't be dealing with what the real issue is, and that is the need for atonement, the need for being made one with God through the shedding of blood, the bringing of a life for life. And this was the regular experience of the people of Israel. As they thought about what the priest did, it wasn't only that the priest made atonement for the people, but the priest needed atonement for himself. Yet you see here in Hebrews 7:28 again, for the law appoints men in their weakness as high priests, but the word of the oath, which came later than the law, appoints a son who has been made perfect forever. And so now, as the author of this letter is explaining to the people how Jesus transcends, the name of this whole series that we've been going through is Jesus is Better in the book of Hebrews. Here is how the author of this letter kicks off this extended conversation regarding how Jesus is better as a high priest. And it's this, that Jesus is better as a high priest because he is a son. And as the son, as the sinless son, as the eternal son, Jesus has no need to bring before the Father any sacrifice for himself. A common experience with sin speaks to us about sympathy and a shared need, but it can never provide a solution to the guilt that we share. This is something where, again, we stop short of God's intention for understanding how we deal with our sin if we simply think it's enough to go to somebody else and talk about it with them. You may find comfort, you may find compassion, you may find sympathy from somebody else. And yet God's intent and God's purpose for us in giving us his son is that not only do we find someone that we can actually go to and find sympathy and find comfort and compassion from, but that we can go to someone who will actually deal with our problem itself. And this is what the Son does. This is how the Son is different. It's the Son himself. The weakness he experienced is a weakness that was required as he experienced death on behalf of his people. 2 Corinthians 5:21 says, for our sake, he made him to be sin who knew no sin, so that in him we might become the righteousness of God. So for the sake of the people, the eternal and spotless Son of God, who had no need to make atonement for himself, who had no need to come before the Father and offer a sacrifice for his own impurity because he is perfect and pure. For our sake, his people, Jesus Christ was made sin. He did not sin, but our sin was transferred onto him like the sin that's transferred on the Day of Atonement to the animals as a picture of what would be necessary for the Son to accomplish. And so as the Son does this, as the Son goes about his work, I want you to think about his whole life as a life of priesthood. If the priest stands before God on behalf of the people, then Jesus' whole life is this business, this regular business of living purely so that he can stand in the presence of the Father. His whole life's business is going about taking care of what's necessary so that when the needs of the people arise, he's not caught with the need to sacrifice something for his own sin because he had none. And so our greatest need was not simply compassion. It wasn't simply sympathy. It wasn't simply being able to go to a person and saying, I understand you know how this goes, and we're going to go to God together and deal with our shared sin. But that God gives us a high priest in his Son who not only has sympathy for us, we've talked in the past couple of weeks, but in having sympathy for us can make atonement, can actually deal with it, and that he can take our cause before God and that we can stand. Hebrews 9:24-26 says, for Christ has entered not into the holy places made with hands, which are copies of the true things, but into heaven itself, now to appear in the presence of God on our behalf. Nor was it to offer himself repeatedly as the high priest enters the holy places every year with blood not his own, for then he would have had to suffer repeatedly since the foundation of the world. But as it is, He has appeared once for all at the end of the ages to put away sin by the sacrifice of himself. And so as Hebrews 9, which we'll look at in a few months, as Hebrews 9 comes upon the scene, as this conversation about the priesthood kind of comes to a close later in the letter, as it comes about here, what he's saying is that, guys, if you're looking for a priest, you're going to find none better than Christ. You're going to find none better than Christ. And if you're looking for a sacrifice that will make you feel confident, that will make you feel sure in the presence of God, you're not going to find it in anything that you can do for yourself. And you're not going to find it in anything that somebody else can give you to do to take care of it yourself. But what you're going to find is that in God giving his Son to be your priest, you have a direct access to the Father by claiming Jesus' righteousness and saying, I am going to trust, I'm going to count on what Jesus has done. And in doing that, you're going to find that the other priesthood is obsolete. And so it really begins this broader conversation about what the priest does. So a priesthood set apart by the Father for the Son. Hebrews 5:5-6. So also Christ did not exalt himself to be made a high priest, but was appointed by him who said to him, You are my son, today I have begotten you, as he says also in another place, you are a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. Jesus did not come to clean up a system of priests set up by men, seeking to one-up fallen men. The system was established by the Father to demonstrate that only the Son of God could meet the needs of those it served. There's a popular way of thinking about the Old Testament. There's a popular way of thinking that's really been around for probably 150 years now that says that the gospel, the good news about what Jesus has done for his people, is kind of a reaction on God's part. It's that God had instituted all these different ways for people to be saved, and they keep failing, and God's like, last-ditch effort, fine, I'm going to send my son, here we go, let's see what happens. There's a popular way of thinking about the gospel that goes like that in relationship to the Old Testament. Yet what I would say, what I think the Bible is clear about, is that Jesus didn't come to say, well, you guys failed, so I'm going to one-up you, and we're just going to kind of get this out of the way. But that the purpose of the whole system being established, when you look at Leviticus 16, when you look at the whole Old Testament story, the whole storyline, is to demonstrate for us that we have this profound need. And in having this profound need, we have to be looking for one who can fill it. And it would have been impossible, completely impossible, for them to take a look at even Aaron, the prototype of the whole priestly system in the Old Testament, to look at Aaron and say, Aaron can make atonement for me and it will count before God. It would have been completely impossible. I mean, imagine seeing me and saying, you know what, I'm going to count on Chris's righteousness to stand before God. If you know me, you know that's definitely not a good idea. And even if you don't know me, that's not a good idea. Because I fail. Because you fail. And for us to put our hope in anybody else is a complete farce. And so the whole point of the priestly system is to see that there was going to come one that God himself would send. There would come one that God would appoint to fill this deep need, and it wasn't for the system itself. The system was kind of a shell. It was a shell that hid what was inside, and that was this need for man to be made right with God. And not a single person who filled that office of Aaron and his sons all the way down the line would be able to actually satisfy that. But that the people would always be looking for one who would come and do this. And so in the priesthood we see that God is demonstrating for us that only his Son could actually meet the real needs that we have. John chapter 8 says this, verses 48-55. The Jews answered him, Are we not right in saying that you are a Samaritan and have a demon? Jesus answered, I do not have a demon, but I honor my Father, and you dishonor me. Yet I do not seek my own glory. There is one who seeks it, and he is the judge. Truly, truly, I say to you, if anyone keeps my word, he will never see death. The Jews said to him, Now we know that you have a demon. Abraham died, as did the prophets, yet you say, If anyone keeps my word, he will never taste death. Are you greater than our father Abraham, who died? And the prophets died. Who do you make yourself out to be? Jesus answered, If I glorify myself, my glory is nothing. It is my Father who glorifies me, of whom you say he is our God, but you have not known him. I know him. If I were to say that I do not know him, I would be a liar like you, but I do know him, and I keep his word. And so as Jesus is talking with the people, as he's revealing, as he's on this earth, walking this earth, how he is relating to all of this that he's fulfilling. As Jesus is self-consciously doing this, as he has spoken multiple times throughout his earthly ministry about his purpose was not to come and do away with the law, but to fulfill it. He makes this unique statement here, and the gospel according to John is really profound in this way, because you get a peek into the inner life of Jesus in a way that Matthew and Mark and Luke don't necessarily give as great a picture of. And so you have John recording these words, and Jesus is saying, look, in my process of doing these things that are necessary, in my process of going about and fulfilling everything my Father has called me to, and that is fulfilling this priesthood. What he's saying is I didn't do this because I decided it'd be fun. I didn't do it because I was going to take upon myself this great desire to do something for my own glory apart from the Father. But what he's saying is that the glory he receives is the glory from the Father, and that the Father's seal of approval rests upon him. This is something that we see really clearly throughout the rest of the Bible. Hebrews 1:5-13. For to which of the angels did God ever say, you are my son, today I have begotten you? Or again, I will be to him a father, and he shall be to me a son. And again, when he brings the firstborn into the world, he says that all God's angels worship him. Of the angels, he says, he makes his angels winds and his ministers a flame of fire. But of the Son, he says, your throne, O God, is forever and ever. The scepter of uprightness is the scepter of your kingdom. You have loved righteousness and hated wickedness. Therefore, God, your God, has anointed you with the oil of gladness beyond your companions. And you, Lord, laid the foundation of the earth in the beginning, and the heavens are the work of your hands. They will perish, but you remain. They will all wear out like a garment. Like a robe, you will roll them up. Like a garment, they will be changed, but you are the same, and your years will have no end. And which of the angels has he ever said, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies a footstool for your feet? And so going back to when we first started Hebrews, you have this in chapter 1. The initial statements that are being made is God is making clear through the author of Hebrews that the one that we're dealing with here is the Son, and that the Son has been approved by the Father. As these verses are quoted from the Old Testament, saying God is so excited for his Son to be doing this business. In Galatians 4, Paul says, but when the fullness of time had come, God sent forth his Son, born of woman, born under the law, to redeem those who were under the law, so that we might receive adoption as sons. See, God is interested in seeing the Son succeed in this task of dealing with his people's needs. This is not something that Jesus just decided, I'm going to leave the glories of heaven and I'm going to come and hang out on this disgusting fallen world. But in this beautiful, beautiful picture of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit, one God and three persons from all of eternity, the Son at the Father's behest says, Dad, I'm going to do this, and I'm going to do it well. And the Father says, I know you're going to do it well, Son. God sent forth his Son. Matthew 17, here's how we see Matthew recording the Father's approval of Jesus' work. After 6 days, Jesus took with him Peter and James and John his brother, and led them up a high mountain by themselves, and he was transfigured before them. And his face shone like the sun, and his clothes became white as light. And behold, there appeared to them Moses and Elijah talking with him. And Peter said to Jesus, Lord, it is good that we are here. If you wish, I will make 3 tents here, one for you and one for Moses and one for Elijah. He was still speaking when, behold, a bright cloud overshadowed them, and a voice from the cloud said, This is my beloved Son, with whom I am well pleased. Listen to him. When the disciples heard this, they fell on their faces and were terrified, but Jesus came and touched them, saying, Rise and have no fear. And so for this little brief moment of time, as the disciples are walking with Jesus, they get a picture of the glory of Jesus. They get a picture of who it is that they've been walking with. Where Aaron needed to go and bathe himself and put on these garments, you have Jesus being revealed for who he really is at this moment. Jesus in his perfection. You see these 2 men that were widely regarded as the most significant figures in the Old Testament, Moses and Elijah, talking with Jesus. And God says, This is my Son. Listen to him. He doesn't say disregard Moses. He doesn't say disregard Elijah. But what he pronounces is this statement on the Son that says, the one you're dealing with, the one that you are walking with, the one that is going to do something for you is my Son. This is the one who is filling the role of priest. This is the one that we are dealing with as we look at Hebrews. So the kind of priest we have Jesus as a different kind of priest than Aaron. We have Jesus who is the Son. These things are established, and yet I want us to walk away this morning with a sense of how Jesus functions differently, how he is a high priest different than what Aaron would have been. Hebrews 5, 7 through 10. In the days of his flesh, Jesus offered up prayers and supplications with loud cries and tears to him who was able to save him from death, and he was heard because of his reverence. Although he was a son, he learned obedience through what he suffered, and being made perfect, he became the source of eternal salvation to all who obey him, being designated by God as a high priest after the order of Melchizedek. So just as the passage opens up in the first few verses with discussion about the weaknesses that are besetting just the merely human priests, you have here this contrast that's being made saying Jesus suffered weakness too. And yet the weakness Jesus suffered is different because he didn't deal with the weakness of his own sin. He dealt with the weakness that was brought upon him so that he could deal with ours. Appointed by the Father, the Son serves as our priest with the greatest of love and care possible in the service of representing us in our need. So for the rest of the morning here, we're going to take a look at the Gospel according to John, because I think it gives us the best picture of Jesus' priesthood and what it means for us. For you to relate to Jesus today, for you to go to Jesus tonight, for you to go to Jesus tomorrow morning, and when you're dealing with your sin, to say, this is the one I am dealing with, and this is the one who is taking my case before God. John 13, 1 through 8. Thinking about the love that Jesus has that far surpassed anything that any of the human priests would have had for the people of Israel. John 13, starting in verse 1. Now before the feast of the Passover, when Jesus knew that his hour had come to depart out of this world to the Father, having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. During supper, when the devil had already put it into the heart of Judas Iscariot, Simon's son, to betray him, Jesus, knowing that the Father had given all things into his hands, and that he had come from God and was going back to God, rose from supper. He laid aside his outer garments, and taking a towel, tied it around his waist. Then he poured water into a basin and began to wash the disciples' feet, and to wipe them with the towel that was wrapped around him. He came to Simon Peter, who said to him, Lord, do you wash my feet? Jesus answered him, what I am doing you do not understand now, but afterward you will understand. Peter said to him, you shall never wash my feet. Jesus answered him, if I do not wash you, you have no share with me. This morning, as I was getting ready, as I pulled into the parking lot here, I prayed something that kind of surprised me. And I asked Jesus to serve me this morning. That can mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people. And yet, as I prayed it, what came to mind for me was this: that for Jesus to be for us what he is means that we need ultimately to be committed to this truth, that Jesus is not impressed with whatever services we perform for him, and that we don't bring to Jesus sacrifices that are pleasing in his sight as though somehow he's going to take those and say, you know what, you are my son, you're my beloved son, I'm pleased with you, everybody should listen to you. But instead of taking the attitude of Peter that we're all prone to, especially if you walk with Jesus for a while, and you think, okay, well, I've got to do the work of ministry, whatever it might look like for you. For Peter, he's thinking, Jesus, there's no way you're going to wash my feet. And that's not because he didn't think Jesus was significant. It's because he knew Jesus to be who he is. And he simply didn't want Jesus to stoop that low. And yet Jesus says here to Peter, unless I wash your feet, you don't have anything to do with me. That's the kind of love that Jesus has for his people, is that he is willing, and not only willing, but it is absolutely essential for Jesus to get into every nook and cranny of your life and to deal with you. For every aspect of who you are, for everything that you would leave out if you were to go and talk to me about your sin. If you were a Jew hanging around 3,000 years ago, you're going to go talk to the priest and say, well, here are the things that I did wrong this week. Jesus knows everything. And he says to Peter here, unless you let me deal with the dirtiest part of who you are, you don't understand what I've come to do. John chapter 17. I actually read this in prayer. Fits in very well for us for this week. This is known as the high priestly prayer, so very fitting for what we are supposed to be understanding as Jesus' role, as starts in Hebrews 5. So I'm going to read this for you guys, and I want you to think, in the book of Hebrews it says that Jesus is always making intercession for us, that Jesus is always praying for us. I want you to think, this is what Jesus prayed for you on this earth, and how much more is he bringing this before the Father on our behalf. When Jesus had spoken these words, he lifted up his eyes to heaven and said, Father, the hour has come. Glorify your Son, that the Son may glorify you, since you have given him authority over all flesh to give eternal life to all whom you have given him. And this is eternal life, that they know you, the only true God, and Jesus Christ whom you have sent. I glorified you on earth, having accomplished the work that you gave me to do, and now, Father, glorify me in your own presence with the glory that I had with you before the world existed. I have manifested your name to the people whom you gave me out of the world. Yours they were, and you gave them to me, and they have kept your word. Now they know that everything that you have given me is from you. For I have given them the words that you gave me, and they have received them, and have come to know in truth that I came from you, and they have believed that you sent me. I am praying for them. I am not praying for the world, but for those whom you have given me, for they are yours. All mine are yours, and yours are mine, and I am glorified in them. And I am no longer in the world, but they are in the world, and I am coming to you. Holy Father, keep them in your name, which you have given me, that they may be one even as we are one. While I was with them, I kept them in your name, which you have given me. I have guarded them, and not one of them has been lost, except the son of destruction, that the scripture might be fulfilled. But now I am coming to you, and these things I speak in the world, that they may have my joy fulfilled in themselves. I have given them your word, and the world has hated them, because they are not of the world, just as I am not of the world. I do not ask that you take them out of the world, but that you keep them from the evil one. They are not of the world, just as I am not of the world. Sanctify them in the truth. Your word is truth. As you sent me into the world, so I have sent them into the world. And for their sake I consecrate myself, that they also may be sanctified in truth. I do not ask for these only, but also for those who will believe in me through their word, that may all be one, just as you, Father, are in me, and I in you, that they also may be in us, so that the world may believe that you have sent me. The glory that you have given me, I have given to them, that they may be one even as we are one. I in them, and you in me, that they may become perfectly one, so that the world may know that you sent me, and love them even as you loved me. Father, I desire that they also, whom you have given me, may be with me where I am, to see my glory that you have given me, because you loved me before the foundation of the world. O righteous Father, even though the world does not know you, I know you, and these know that you have sent me. I made known to them your name, and I will continue to make it known, that the love with which you have loved me may be in them, and I in them. So this is Jesus' heart for his people as he lays it out before the Father in John 17. Jesus is praying that we would be protected from evil, that we be protected from false doctrine, that the church would be unified in its love for each other and its love for him. These are the things that Jesus, the high priest, is going before his Father, and he's pleading with him. Father, please do these things. That's what it means for Jesus to be our high priest. Right now, on our behalf, Jesus is praying things like these for his people. And yet you see the weakness Jesus experienced, not just Jesus praying these things. John 18:1 says, when Jesus had spoken these words, he went out with his disciples across the brook Kidron, where there was a garden, which he and his disciples entered. Matthew picks up from there what this time in the garden looked like. Then Jesus went with them to a place called Gethsemane, and he said to his disciples, sit here while I go over there and pray. Taking with him Peter and the two sons of Zebedee, these are his three best friends, he began to be sorrowful and troubled. Then he said to them, "My soul is very sorrowful, even to death. Remain here and watch with me." And going a little farther, he fell on his face and prayed, saying, "My Father, if it be possible, let this cup pass from me. Nevertheless, not as I will, but as you will." And he came to the disciples and found them sleeping. And he said to Peter, "So could you not watch with me 1 hour? Watch and pray that you may not enter into temptation. The spirit indeed is willing, but the flesh is weak." Again, for the second time, he went away and prayed, "My Father, if this cannot pass unless I drink it, your will be done." And again he came and found them sleeping, for their eyes were heavy. So leaving them again, he went away and prayed for the third time, saying the same words again. Then he came to the disciples and said to them, "Sleep and take your rest later on. See, the hour is at hand, and the Son of Man is betrayed into the hands of sinners. Rise, let us be going. See, my betrayer is at hand." So Hebrews 5:7-9 characterizes what just happened as this. In the days of his flesh, Jesus offered up prayers and supplications with loud cries and tears to him who was able to save him from death. And he was heard because of his reverence. Although he was a son, he learned obedience through what he suffered, and being made perfect, he became the source of eternal salvation to all who obey him. So as Jesus is there in this garden, he's praying for his friends, and his friends are passing out on him. I don't know if you've ever had a moment where you're spending time with somebody, you're really eager, you're really excited to spend time with them, and they just kind of start dozing off. You can feel kind of like, "Oh, I really want you to experience this, really want you to be part of this." And for Jesus, he's there with his three best friends, and not only is this something where he wants them to be praying with him, but he's scared and he's alone. And yet he goes before the Father, and instead of saying, "I don't want to do this, I'm out of here," he just continues to submit himself to his Father's design, which is as a priest appointed by him to go and to bear the guilt, to bear the sin of the people, so that we could be represented before him righteously and justly. That's the weakness Jesus experienced, saying although he was a son, he learned obedience through what he suffered, that Jesus suffered and he didn't have to. John 18, John continues then, "Now Judas, who betrayed him, also knew the place, for Jesus often met there with his disciples. So Judas, having procured a band of soldiers and some officers from the chief priests and the Pharisees, went there with lanterns and torches and weapons." Back in John 13, a short while, a couple hours before this happened, Jesus is washing Judas's feet. So think about that. In John 17, you have Jesus praying, and he's acknowledging there's one of the people who have followed me that's going to be lost. He knew it the whole time. And yet Jesus stoops low as the one whom the Father said, "This is my son, listen to him," who was transfigured, who Aaron was picturing when he put on these beautiful garments in holiness and purity. And Jesus stoops down and he washes the feet of this man who would betray him. I mean, it says that Judas went after that place because that's where Jesus met with him. He knew exactly where Jesus would be because that's where Jesus would go, and he would care for his people, where he would love them, where he would share his heart with them. And Judas said, "I know exactly where Jesus is going to be. He's going to be over there. He's going to be in this garden. And here's what I'm going to do, because this Jesus didn't fulfill for me what I wanted. I'm going to sell him off." And Jesus knew the whole time. That's the character of Jesus toward his people. Now, Judas was ultimately not one of his people. He professed to be. But then you see another disciple, Peter, who goes and he sells out Jesus. And Jesus lovingly restores him. That's the character of Christ as our high priest. Not one who has to offer a sacrifice for himself, not one who has to say, "Well, you did okay, but you got to do better next time." Not one who says, "You really screwed up and you better make amends for yourself." But one who washed the feet of the one who would betray him. the one who said to his best friend, unless you let me deal with the dirtiest parts of who you are, you don't understand what I came to do. That's who Jesus is. We'll close with this. John, one of Jesus' disciples, one of his closest friends, said this to the church he was writing to. In this, the love of God was made manifest among us, that God sent his only Son into the world so that we might live through him. In this is love, not that we have loved God, but that he loved us and sent his Son to be the propitiation for our sins, that is, to be the wrath bearer, to be the wrath absorber, to be the one who took our punishment. That's what God sent his Son to do. And so over the next couple of months, as we talk about Jesus, the great high priest, and how he's better than Melchizedek and better than Aaron and all of these things, I want us to be intensely aware that Jesus' role is one he delights in. And that it is absolutely essential for us as Christian people to look at Jesus and say, I need to go to him to deal with me. Nothing else is going to do it. Nothing else will do. Only Jesus. Jesus is better than anything else. So we'll pray and we'll close in song. Jesus, we come to you and we thank you that even when we do things that are so insanely stupid, things that we know much better than to do, that you still speak to us the way you spoke to Peter, that said, unless you let me deal with that, unless you let me take care of that, you don't have any idea what I am here for. So as our priest, Jesus, we come before you and we would bring every issue that we know in our hearts to be dealing with, and every issue we don't even understand we have to deal with before you. Say, please make us clean. Make us whole. Even as you have forgiven us. So, Lord, we just need regularly to experience that refreshment that the gospel brings. So we pray that as we celebrate your love for us this morning, that you would remind us, that you would do in us great things this week by causing us to be more open and honest with you and to reflect that to others and to be clearer displays of a great love that you have for your people. So, Father, please receive what we offer up to you in song, in Jesus' name.